I had a conversation with Sam Cedar just this past weekend, or this Friday, and it was interesting because he pointed out that the economy looks good on paper, but it's because wealthy people and big corporations are making a lot of money, but your average person is not. And I was like, well, that's very honest from a very liberal guy. And I agree. The numbers look good because we're looking at these big corporations that seem to be doing well, but regular people are feeling the groceries through the roof. Then you look at the crime stats, and I think what they're missing when they say, oh, but relatively crime is down compared to, however many years ago. Yes, but what crime is up and what crime is down? If overall, like, shoplifting goes up, that's going to affect the numbers. I think that's one of the points he made. Shoplifting is skyrocketing, so the crime rates do go up. But if, like small property crimes of, vandalism maybe on people's property is going down, but muggings and murders and things like that are going up.
Also, a lot of that stuff is getting reclassified by the cops. So the cops aren't actually policing a lot of the small crimes because they're afraid that if they get caught on camera policing it, maybe they go to jail. I mean, I'm talking to a lot of these cops in these cities. Again, I have a bunch of friends in LAPD. One in particular, they're all looking to retire early and get the hell out and move away from Los Angeles. I mean, these are some of the most understaffed major cities. LA has the worst ratio of police to population of any major city in America, which is why it took 15 minutes for anybody to respond to the 911 phone call. And then it was really funny. The cops drove up and they're like, which way did they go? We're like, that way. 15 minutes ago. They was like, okay. He just takes off down the street.
So although this is, I think for this article from The Telegraph, I think it's a little bit narrowly focused on only violence potentially from Trump supporters. But there's a grain in truth in that the election is most likely, we're not going to get the results for a few days. And whatever side loses will most definitely deny the results in either a highbrow or lowbrow way that could potentially lead to some sort of violence, either fringe violence in Seattle or depending on how bad it could get. I don't know what we should expect, but I don't think these stores are wrong to prepare like this, especially given what we're hearing in the media and how close the election will be.
No, the rhetoric's been ratcheted up so far in the country. And you could say on both sides, except that one side, at the worst, you can say they have bad rhetoric. The other side actually acts on their rhetoric. I mean, you've had essentially the president of the United States and the vice president of the United States and the former president of the United States and the former but one president of the United States all saying that the Republican nominee is a clear and present danger, is a threat to democracy.
And to that point today, they're chastising George Bush for not coming out and saying that. So
that's exactly right. And so, even after Donald Trump's, there have been 2 attempted assassinations on the guy, they still denounce all of his rhetoric while inflaming passions on their side. So you've got, in a way, you have both sides coming at this election thinking that their way of life will end if the other person ascends to the presidency. That raises the stakes enormously and raises the chances of violence enormously.
I think you also have to look at the possible flashpoints here. So when the right tends to riot, it's when there's a flashpoint, right? Like January 6th, the riot, that's a riot with a flashpoint where people thought they were doing a thing. When the left riots, it's just because they're pissed off about a thing, and it's going to burn down a city and like grab a computer or a TV or something. And so that's a completely different kind.
I do think, as the chance of escalation, I think is higher from the right than the left, but there's caveats to that. When the right does riot, it's January 6th. They almost never do. They barely protest. They don't go out. But then it's at the Capitol during the certification, which is the worst possible time for a riot. The left, it's every summer we call it like, oh, it's summer, the riots are starting again.
I want to push back just a little bit. I'm probably the most Trump skeptical of all of the occasional hosts of, I say occasional because I only occasionally host, of all the hosts at the Daily Wire, and have always been firmly of the opinion that January 6th is kind of a national tragedy. And yet, it's not as though 1 million people went to Washington, D.C. to riot. The vast majority of the people who were at the Capitol were there to protest what they saw as the unfair results of the election, what they saw as the unfair set of rules that had been structured around the election. Some of them to protest what they thought was the outright stealing of the election. I happen to disagree with that, although the first 2 I certainly agree with. And some very small fraction of those people actually engaged in some rioting. And even that, while I don't think that it's, I'm not so naive as to say like every conservative who got arrested was innocent. I don't think that's true. I do think that there are instigators who were not prosecuted at the Capitol who probably weren't even conservative.
Yeah, but fair point.
But when people show up to say, burn down Minneapolis after the death of George Floyd, people aren't just showing up to protest. They're showing up to do violence. They have websites telling them how to survive tear gas, how to attack cops who have riot shields. They prepare for those consequences because they are there for the purpose of rioting. And so while it is true that no one's perfect in this country, no one's perfect in this life, Sometimes there's violence that comes from the American right.
Let me-
there is a kind of institutionalized rioting and violence that's accepted on the left that you do not see accepted on the
Jimmy,
right.
Let me real quick. I'll revise a little bit because I agree with what you're saying largely. For the longest time, I've been making this point over the past 10 years that when the right is not organized, the January 6th was not organized, but whenever there's some kind of incident or something from a person who has in any way some modicum of right-leaning politics, it's the right doing it, it's the far right doing it.
Right.
But what I would say is, probably in the past 4 to 6 years, this has shifted dramatically. The protests that I saw in around the Occupy era, and even in the 2000s when I was in a lot of these protests, I would refer to as blunt. It's like a leftist punches a guy in the face, and it happens all the time. We have actually a story right now. A guy had a flag in his yard. The guy went to his house and beat the crap out of him. But no one really cares that much to hear that a guy got beat up. But it does happen a lot. And so I feel like what the left typically engages in never really rises to that extreme level that makes the news. But then again, I would say I'd actually defer to you a little bit and say you're right. Because in the past several years with the White House, with the firebombing of the White House on May 29th, 2020, they were throwing firebombs in the White House grounds, set fire to St. John's Church, as well as John Hodgkinson, the baseball shooter. We have actually seen a combination of the blunt and the escalation of the left. Thanks for checking out this clip from Timcast IRL. Make sure to watch the show live Monday through Friday at 8 p.m. Subscribe to this channel, and we will see you all there.